All right, Daniel. So
Cool.
your time has come. Just a little bit of information about Daniel. Daniel is a PhD. Um, is a PhD. We'll be discussing the bizarre mental states he went through and his desperate need to restore and make sense of what he lost after his brain injury. His recovery experience fits well with Dr. Tracer's functional neurology approach, as the work needed to rebuild one's cognition and memory systems, while also recognizing that it is so painfully slow and strange. And he got his PhD in neuroscience from Dartmouth College in 2013, and his BS at the University of California, Irvine. Yeah, everyone, welcome Daniel back.
Cool. So everyone is seeing my slides
Yep.
and everyone is seeing me. Okay, so let's begin. So I want to thank everyone for being here and thank the speakers, Dr. Traster and Willie and everyone else. I think this is information that really needs to be out there. So I got into neuroscience to try and make some sense of what happened to me after my brain injury. I probably got into neuroscience as a biology major about 4 or 5 years after my brain injury. Before that, I was just completely needing to restore what I had lost. And through neuroscience, I kind of gained a little bit of understanding, and that has progressed to where I am today. So I see this talk as having, really this whole seminar is having two audiences. Those of us that have brain injuries and the rest of you, which I'm calling the non-brain injured world. And I think for both groups, although we're in very different situations, it helps to make sense of what we're dealing with if we do think about the processes in the brain. For those of us with brain injuries, thinking about the processes in us can at least give some foundation or some framework to make sense of what has changed in us, especially if we want to try to approach how to deal with it, how to make sense of it, and how to potentially improve what is in us. And for the non-brain injured world, in my experience, people without brain injuries really don't understand what we're dealing with. To quote Randy, you can't imagine it because it's so strange. So a little bit about my brain injury. In 1999, I was in a car accident, and here's actually the car. I was sitting in that right back seat. You can see I have a plate on the right side of my head. Hope you guys can see that. My head was, I guess, crushed in, and it was pretty bad. I had a subdural hematoma, and I guess I had a skull fracture because I was bleeding pretty bad, but I was airlifted to Cedars-Sinai, and I went through a craniotomy and about 11 days of intubation. I was in the hospital for about 34 days. And after that, I just dealt with a tremendous amount of problems. I was thinking what Dr. Traster was talking about, and a lot of other people have a mild brain injury, concussion. I guess mine was more severe, but it's still the same kinds of problems, and it's still the same nature overall. So I have a list of problems. I had double vision, and fortunately in 1999, I was able to be part of experimental therapy at the time to restore function of my the cognitive nerve in my right eye. And it took a few months, but I worked very hard and I was able to get the eye to move again, and the double vision went away. I also had tremendous memory and cognitive problems, emotional regulation, the sleep issues I'm still dealing with, and I had this really weird brain pressure that I can relieve with water, and I've never had that diagnosed, or I haven't really met anyone that even understands what I was dealing with, but I'm doing it today. And as you can see, when I'm drinking these giant cups of water, it's to relieve that pressure. But the weirdest experience I had, which I want to start with, was this feeling that my mind was not my mind. And it still doesn't totally make sense, but the best way I've found to explain it is so imagine a hypothetical situation where you're in solitary confinement and you're in a hole or in a in a cell for 24 hours, let's say. I'm not trying to promote an anxiety. You will get out of this hypothetical hole, but just what would be going on in a person's mind if you're sitting there in the dark by yourself? There's a lot of inner thought. There's a lot of inner self, and I guess that's what I lost after my brain injury, and it was a very strange experience because I couldn't I remember trying to explain it to doctors and therapists, and they didn't really understand what I was talking about. And I just stayed that way for years, and I kind of got used to it. And I also realized that people don't understand or don't realize that I have that problem, so I just kept it to myself. But as a neuroscientist, and especially when I was in undergrad and early graduate school, I was kind of taking tabs on any systems and any processes in the brain to try to understand what had happened to me. So the first one was inner speech. And inner speech is something I think we're all familiar with. When a child, early in development, kids are usually vocalizing and speaking out loud, but then eventually they internalize that. And I guess it's our inner thoughts. And I think that I had lost that. I'm going to use inner speech as a good example first to introduce it, and then to get into more detail about networks. You can call them networks, you can call them processes, you can call them systems in the brain, but we're going to visit a few, and I'm going to use inner speech to exemplify that. So here's an interesting paper, and they actually modeled inner speech. They used a bunch of data from a bunch of other studies. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a lot of colored regions that are, there's also arrows and numbers. So the blue region in the center and the orange region next to it, inferior parietal lobe and temporal parietal junction. This paper, as well as a lot of others, show that the right parietal regions are involved in creating inner speech. And for me, that was a great relief to learn about this, because I guess in my mind, I thought, okay, I lost that. There's a physical system in me that creates what is going on in my mind, and I lost that. And I don't know, just having that foundation of something that was in the brain that got damaged, that at least was a little bit of a relief. I'm going to get more into that, but let's go into the thinking about what these networks are showing us. So each region in the classical model, especially the classical model of how we think about the brain, is a collection of neurons, a collection of brain cells that all fire and interact and share information with each other. And consistent with their sharing information within the regions, they also share it across the regions. So I'm going to jump ahead to this figure. There's a pretty good review. And what we see here in the upper brain diagram, we have a lot of nodes, a lot of circles with arrows. The brain is constantly, or the cells in the brain are constantly sending information back and forth. And together, it's thought that this network of activity is producing mental processes. We see in the circles below the brain diagram, there's a very intricate level of cells, and they're highly interconnected. I actually did my PhD at this level in rodents. So the cellular level that we understand today, especially in rodents, I think that there still are regions of brain, networks of brain that produce specific functions such as memory, such as aspects of cognition, but the level with which the cells interact is so diffuse that it is somewhat accurate to say it's a brain-wide region or it's a brain-wide function. But this level of diffusion really isn't understood. It's only now being explored and starting to be understood in rodents. I think with the rodent brain, you can do a lot more. Also, there's the synaptic level, and I'm not really going to get into that synaptic level or the glia or the vasculature. Needless to say, these regions of brain do produce functions, and I think most of this data has come out through brain imaging. Another term that I think is important is to just think about structural connectivity versus functional connectivity. So structural connectivity is literally the anatomy, the connections of the cells and the cells that produce nodes, and it's sort of like expanding out, but it's always composed of neurons connecting with one another. The functional connectivity, on the other hand, is the activity that rides along these cells, that rides along these connections. And it's the functional connectivity that is ultimately producing different mental processes. I have another figure here that I thought was important just because when you have brain damage or injury, so we're looking in figure A, there's regions of brain that have connections between them. So area 46 and area 40 have a lot of activity, and then there's also activity occurring between the two regions. But if you have damage, or I think both damage and injury, because there isn't always the data and the functional imaging doesn't always show there can be an injury and it might not be seen with the brain imaging, but there's still definitely a loss or a change in the function. So all this figure is showing is that damage to a certain area affects both that area and the connection with other areas, and how that impacts one's experience and one's ability to access things in their mind. It's pretty drastic. So I think I have to show this figure too, because no matter what, the science is pretty elaborate, but the physical basis of what is happening, somehow it's producing something mental, and we don't know how that works. It's magic or it's a mystery. I think maybe eventually we'll discover it. Needless to say, for me, learning about inner speech was helpful because it helped me to start to make sense of the feeling that my mind was not my mind. However, the more I started learning and reading about inner speech, I realized that it really is inner thought. And what had changed in me, it wasn't just when I have a thought, it was separate from the thoughts or in between the thoughts. I felt like something that was in me was just different. And I remember learning about the default mode network, and that actually kind of helped me even more. So I'm not going to get into detail explaining the default mode network. We have an expert here today, Dr. Jeremy Huckins, will get into great detail. But this system in the brain, this network in the brain, is thought to be online. It's thought to be active when you're not focused on a task, when you're not doing something specific, when you're at a sort of internal state or in a thinking state or in a daydreaming state. So what we're seeing here in figure A, this is data from a group of subjects. When they're focusing on a task, this network is suppressed. This network is inactive. But when they're not focusing on a task and asked to either daydream or think or kind of do nothing, then this whole level of activity comes online. So I think, and this is just a postulation, but I think I injured both the inner speech and the default mode network. And my injury was almost the whole right side of my brain, and a lot of the data showing what regions are involved in these networks is definitely right side, right parietal, frontal, and visual. And I just needless to say, learning about these networks helped me make sense of what I had lost to a certain extent. Another drastic problem I had was cognition. And I think I'm going to go through this paper first, or just thinking about the subsets, the sub-details of cognition, and then I'm going to share my own experience. So an interesting study that actually modeled the levels and layers of what is involved in cognition, or they called it real-world problem solving. So let's think of any problem, like maybe trying to do a math problem, or trying to build a fence, or trying to do some kind of, we all deal with problems, so we know what problem solving is like. So in the beginning, you take the information that is presented to you and you have to represent it in your mind, and the representation of the details is carried on to planning, to forming some kind of strategy. Let's say you've never dealt with this kind of problem, then you're going to need to explore and figure things out for yourself. But let's say it's a problem that you've done 1,000 times, then you can exploit a very known strategy and just attack it right away. So the planning and the representation are two different phases. Another one is plan execution. So once you have the idea of what you're going to do, you form a mental template. Once you've constructed it, you execute it, and your mind is always supervising what is happening. If you come to an impasse, such as an error or a block, you're going to reanalyze, you're going to refocus, you're going to re-strategize. And this paper focused on the idea that there's two types of attention. Defocused attention is when you need to form a new association, you need to be creative and figure things out, versus focused attention is very analytical, especially, like I said, if you're doing a problem that you've done many times. So I like this paper because everything here that I highlighted in red, they get into great detail about the networks and brain systems that are involved in each and every single part. So here's one of the many figures from this paper, but they're showing that in the planning phase, you have the blue regions, and I don't need to get into the abbreviations of these brain areas, but in the planning, in the discovery and detection, in the defocused or focused attention, your brain is using all these different parts to produce this function. So, or produce, this set of functions. So going back to this list, I can tell you that after my brain injury, I sat with a therapist, a speech therapist, and I remember we tried to do a math problem, and I think it was a algebra problem, two equations, two unknowns. And I tried to do the problem, I couldn't, but I knew that I knew how to do it. So I focused, and that was the first time I had the crash, this mental crash that basically put me in bed for, I don't want to say a few days, but it was at least like 2 days, and I was completely mentally exhausted. And just trying to even access the working memory part, trying to have a representation in my head, it did not work. I spent several months working with this therapist, and she got me drilling very basic mathematical, doing addition in my head and subtraction in my head. And as I got better at that, she got a metronome and she made me have to do the math at a beat that was a little bit faster than what I can do. And after many months of working with her, I sat to do a math problem again, and I could do one math problem and then the mental crash. Also, or in addition to that, I don't remember this well, but my mom does, and my mom got involved with helping. They would read me a story. I couldn't read because I had double vision, but they would read me a story, and it was like a very basic like fable or a moral, and they would ask me what the moral of the story is, and my mom says I was basically like a child or like a toddler, where I would just pick random facts from the story, put them together, and that was what the story was about. I don't think I had any analytical thinking, even basic reasoning. And fortunately, my mom got involved and she sat with me. I think it took about 6 months working with her and the therapist. And my mom says that one day the analytical thinking just came back. And I'm afraid to think of what it would have been like if I didn't have the help that I had. So needless to say, after, it wasn't a easy process, but after I could even start to do math or start to do the basic thinking, getting any information into my head, that took forever. That was like one of the most, another one of the most bizarre processes I had. For example, I would sit in these lectures. I retook the classes I had done very well with in high school, and I could follow the lecture. I could make some notes. Then I would get the teacher's notes and a note taker's notes. But to get the information into my mind, that didn't happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. So, and it ended up, the strategy I developed was to look over the notes and rewrite them and think through it. And I would rewrite it and rewrite it again and rewrite it again, probably 7 or 8 times in the beginning. And then I could say, okay, the information is now in my head. Then I would start to do the planning and the plan execution to solve basic math problems. This happened in pretty much every class through the first 3 or 4 years of my undergraduate. And I would always hit that blank out point. I would always hit that crash where I was just out. And it became a balancing act of not crashing so that I could do the work. And there was many years like that. Once I got past the crashes, then I had years of just moving through mental mud, moving through every aspect of thinking was very slow and very, very difficult. But I think around the 5 year mark, it started to get better. It started to get faster and more fluid. But it wasn't until about 7 years that it actually worked, or actually felt like, I guess, like a fluid thought, like how it used to be. So I just think it's important to, realize what is happening in us when we are rebuilding these parts of us. Another study I wanted to include real fast is, so this study was a meta-analysis. They had over almost 2,000 subjects, and they looked at different studies, mathematical problem solving versus verbal problem solving versus visuospatial. And although there was a lot of brain regions that interacted across these different types of problem solving, they show here very distinct regions that are only involved in mathematical, only involved in verbal, and only involved in visuospatial. And I think I really injured more of what was involved in mathematical and that type of more complex thinking, because the verbal stuff and I guess humanities classes, that took about 2 or 3 years to be able to function and feel normal in those classes. But the mathematical and other stuff, it took, yeah, I'd say about 7 years. lastly, I'm not going to get into the memory systems. I want to thank Willie, and next, Dr. Jeremy Berry is going to get more into these systems. But for me, spatial memory and declarative memory, it was a mess. So spatial memory, navigating an area, having, what's the term we use? Doesn't matter. But having some spatial awareness, so I went back to school. I had a year when I was doing classes and working with a therapist. Then I went back to school, and I would get lost as easily as could be. I had no spatial memory, no ability to kind of understand the where I was in the world around me. And fortunately, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to UC Irvine, but the whole campus is built around a ring. It's called Ring Road, and it's about a mile in circumference. So all I had to do was find the ring road and then walk it until I kind of found where I needed to go. And I remember for hours being lost and walking around, and patience was essential in that case. But for years after that, although I didn't live on campus, I would still park in the same area, and I would just always walk the same route. And slowly, I was able to rebuild my spatial memory. Again, I'd say it took about 3 or 4 years, but my strategy just became to always walk the same exact path. I have dreams of walking that same path. I had many dreams, especially during those first few years. The other thing was declarative memory, and that's the term for memorizing names and facts. And for me, I could not do it for the life of me for many years, and it was extremely frustrating. I had a lot of biology classes where I was getting C's and D's because I just couldn't. I understood the information, but I couldn't memorize it. And once I started taking neuroscience classes and learning about the system of memory, my strategy changed from trying to remember to just blatant repetition. So anything I had to memorize, I would do these sessions in the morning, about 10 sessions during the day, and then sessions in the evening. And it became a lot more work. But the strategy wasn't to try to remember, just to repeat over and over and over and over and over and over. And it was, hours of work, but the memory started to come back. I started getting like B's, B pluses, A minuses in these classes. And eventually I feel like the whole memory system came back. And again, this was about like 5 years of this repetition. But I remember before that being so frustrated and not able to access the memory. So just blatant use of that system is what brought it back for me. So given all that, knowing about the brain networks, I think, and knowing about what underlies what is damaged in us, what has changed in us, I think that offers a framework that can help other people make sense of what has changed in them. And I think that information is somewhat lacking out there. So I'm hoping that through this talk and other seminars, we'd be able to do that. So here's a graph that I've been thinking about for a while. What systems are in us that are obvious versus what isn't? So I think memory and cognition is pretty obvious. There's a lot of movies about people getting hit in the head and then their memory doesn't work, but I've never seen it so much with cognition, with internal speech, or let alone the default mode network. But I do, from my experience, I think I lost that. And I think any of these regions, when we get a concussion or we get some form of brain injury, these regions can be changed in us, and the ending reality in us is very, very bizarre. We're going to have speakers today talking about the sense of smell as well as executive function, and so these are on this this table as well. And I think sensations such as vision, smell, hearing, it's more obvious to us that that is something controlled by our brain. But I think executive function, like the default mode network, if you don't learn about it, then you don't necessarily think about it. And it is very much a system in us. So again, hopefully, if you have a brain injury, if you have had a concussion, just thinking about what has changed in you and centering it around the framework of these systems, it is helpful. At least it was for me. Another system, and I just got a few more slides here, but another system that I thought was important, between the default mode network and executive function, default mode being something that's self-referential, something that's inner thought, and executive function is very externally driven, cognitively focused, and looking at the outside world. There's actually the saliency network, which controls attention. And I've spoken to multiple people with brain injuries who I guess the conclusion is that they have ADD because of their brain injury, but rather I think it's important to think about it as you can damage the saliency network. And I don't hear people talking about it in that framework. And I think that if you think about it like that and then work to restore it, maybe that can help. And since we have this figure here of the less obvious versus the more obvious, I'm just going to throw a few more things out there. Speech, I think speech therapists do a good job of focusing on it, but the nature of that system isn't so different from the other networks, the other systems in us. Also, emotions being created in us. If you have injury to the limbic regions, injury to the regions that create emotions, I think that can create a very bizarre reality, but looking at it as injury to that system can help. Also, social cognition, interaction, and awareness. And all of these regions in red, I'm hoping we can, in the future, talk about in future seminars. Another interesting one is having motivation versus the ability to initiate a task. You can have the motivation, but if you have injury to the parts of you that initiate the task, it's actually a very different region. And, I'm going to keep going here. Vision, hearing, bodily sensation, pain, headache, migraine. I think it's more obvious that the brain is producing those, but I don't know if people always think about it that way. The vestibular system, personality, and hormonal regulation. I think people don't realize how much personality can be created by networks and parts of our brain. And I've been reading recently a lot about hormonal regulation and brain injury, but I don't know if people think about it that way.
You were reading about what?
There's a doctor that had a head injury and it changed his hormonal regulation. And now he's really focused on looking at doing hormonal testing with people post brain injury. And so I think hormonal regulation is looked at more. But I actually forget his name. I still forget a lot of names. In fact, I have to rewrite it over and over in order to retain it. So in conclusion, I just have a few more slides. This is a concept I've thought about for a long time. I think the core problems after brain injury are very different from other problems that people have. These problems are due to actual damage to our physical brain. And you cannot simply change them by trying or by focusing. Really what works is slow steps, and it's almost like baby steps. And I'm going to postulate that I think the core problems are underlying the other problems being the normal ways people, deal with trauma and deal with difficult situations. I think the core problems in us aren't so well addressed. Dr. Traster, he's aware of it. He does an amazing job, but more of the people I've spoken to, and in my experience, the doctors didn't really know what we were dealing with. Lastly, I've been working on a project and I wish I could launch it today, but I don't have it ready yet. I'm calling it the Experiencing My Brain Project, and it's a podcast of discussion with brain injury survivors to really get at, in long form discussion, what we have to deal with. And I'm writing a blog to share ideas and concepts. And the goal is ultimately to promote discussion and awareness of, what we're dealing with, because I don't think that people really understand it. So thank you. And I just want to say this whole talk is focused on getting scientists, getting people to who know about these specific systems to talk about it and share it. And hopefully that information will translate to people with brain injuries and the people who are the clinicians that work with us, our family, our friends, just to understand a little bit more about things in us that can get damaged and changed with physical injury. So any questions?
Probably, but I don't know what off the top of my head.
No worries.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
That was good, Daniel.
Hey, thanks.
Daniel, I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
First, I want to thank you so much. This really does open up a lot of awareness, so at least people can ask and research for help for it. And it's been interesting, some of the things that you brought up. I had mentioned to some of my doctors, various ones, and they just look at me quizzical, like, I don't think so. I don't think ear ringing is part of that, or, is not directly associated with it. But I was going to ask you, one thing I've noticed that I grapple with is I notice I can put things together verbally pretty well in my head, but then when I go to actually speak it,
Mhm.
I can't put like what I put together well in my head can't come back out my mouth very well. Is that
Articulation is
yes?
what you're
Thank
saying.
you. Good
Yeah, I
word.
think that's so, you know, in the figure that I made, I'm just kind of threw a bunch of networks or systems that I've learned about together. But ultimately, yeah, that being able to have the thought and organize it clearly inside of your mind versus the articulation involves one, the physical process of the speech, and also the, you know, there's a whole level that is recruited in order to use that. And if that's difficult for you, I'm sorry you have to deal with that. The only thing that I could say based on my experience is, I guess you have to practice it, and you have to, you know, it's not going to come back automatically, but through repetition and use. And I guess for some people, qualifying what we're dealing with before we try to do it with others, it may help. But yeah, that's a perfect example of it. There's so much recruited in generating of speech versus in having the thoughts in our mind. So I think that's a good example of it. And I know I don't want to say that what I dealt with was easy. It was actually the most difficult thing I ever dealt with. So doing it once, if you can do it once, you can do it twice. And after a number of times, it starts to come back very slowly. But yeah, if that's super hard for you, that's going to be a difficult road. But if you can even start it, that's an improvement, you know. Practicing it like crazy, kind of what Dr. Traster was saying, that if you don't use it, you lose it. But yeah, I think of it as that's a good example of a system or a subsystem. Taking the thought into speech is definitely something in you that needs to be recruited and used a bunch of times.
Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate you sharing with us today. And did anyone have any final questions before we move on to the next speaker?
Is there a name of a particular podcast that you do like to follow? And then also, are there studies, post like brain injury studies that we might be able to volunteer for to learn more too?
I know that there's a lot of studies. I've been a subject in multiple studies, but you know, I think with research, they're always focused on such particular things that I haven't found anything that translates to the whole experience. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely research out there, and to be involved in studies is, I'm not gonna say it's easy, but you can find it. I haven't found a podcast that I like, and really this whole process for me, I feel like I've been in between worlds. I read the neuroscience and I read these you know, papers. I have a box of books actually by neuroscientists talking about these processes, but none of them really understand what changes in you after a brain injury. And then I like Amy Zeller's podcast. She has a tremendous amount of work out there, and I see it as a person that's had a brain injury that's trying to make sense of what happened to them, and also Kevin Ballister. But then I feel like the brain injury experience isn't represented in the way that I've come to know it. So I kind of there's a lot of good stuff out there, but I haven't found anything that I feel like is really great or represents what I've been through. And yeah, I think it's hard. I think one good thing is there's a lot more blogs and podcasts, people trying to share what they've been through, and I think that's absolutely necessary. But you know, nothing jumps out as like, ah, that's the one. So sorry.
The most valuable thing that I found with regard to the question that was just asked
Yeah.
was this book called The Mind's Own Physician. I just put it up on the chat. There's other books as well, but that was probably at its core. And
I had about
everything is a lot easier said than done.
right. I had about 17 years in the time that I wasn't talking about my brain injury, I also was ignoring the information out there. I was just focusing on the science and trying to be a scientist. But in the back of my mind, I was always needing to understand what had happened to me. So at least now I'm, talking about it with people. All right, well, thank you all very much. And, I really appreciate everyone being involved in this, the speakers and everyone who's attending. And, this is all being recorded. So hopefully we can share with more people in the future.